he was George's best friend. And what Andrew gave to Wham was it. George couldn't have done it on his own. In the early days, George was too shy. He couldn't have got up there on stage. He couldn't have been a solo artist. So he needed the camaraderie and support of Andrew. So that's why they were a duo together. But an interesting facet of that, as managers, they had no success. They had a little bit of early success with a bad contract. Along come Jazz and Simon, who wants to manage them, get them out of their bad contract and take them further. And that was when George reveals to them that he's now starting to feel he wants to go solo eventually. He doesn't know when, but he's ready to play in a group for Wham. And so Jazz and Simon said, great, that's fantastic, because the life of a pop group could be about 5-6 years. That was the perception at that day. I mean, artists with the exception of the Beatles and the Stones and the Who, most pop groups from the 60s or 70s lasted about 4 or 5 years. And Jazz and Simon thought, great, if we have 5 years managing Wham and we break them in America and they do big tours, we'll be very wealthy, everyone will be happy. What they didn't understand was that George was already straining at the leash. He'd had enough of being a bubblegum artist. I mean, he couldn't stand that press coverage and all the teeny bop stuff. He wanted to be a serious artist. He wanted to be taken seriously like Elton John or Stevie Wonder or Aretha Franklin. He wanted to, or artists of that, or Brian Ferry. He wanted to be a serious artist. He couldn't be that if he was always in a pop group. And Andrew was fine with that because Andrew had his film, had his fun, and they knew that was going to happen. But Jazz and Simon thought that was 5 years into the future. When they got back from China, George and I started having conversations, and I was about 10 years older than him, so he was asking me about the Beatles and stuff like that, and I told him, and he said, I want to be a serious artist. I don't want to be regarded like Culture Club. I don't want to be regarded like the bubblegum act. I want to be a serious artist. And I talked with him about how the Beatles individually when they broke up. And that was and I'd also worked a lot with Sting, who had just left the Police. I was the person who first put Sting as a solo act in a thing called The Secret Policeman's Ball. And that was what led to Sting leaving the Police because he wanted to be free. So George was listening to all this and interested in that. And he said to Jazz and Simon, I'm bringing forward the timetable. I think I'm going to break up Wham next year. Jazz and Simon were going, you just toured America, you just made, and to them it was crazy because they thought this would, the golden goose, literally with George at that time, golden whuffed goose, was laying the golden eggs. They thought they were going to cash in for another 5 years, and suddenly he's saying it's over. Next year is the end. On top of that, not known by the public, but because George and Andrew had a bad experience with their first managers, they never signed a contract with Simon and Jazz. They only did a handshake. A handshake doesn't last very well in a courtroom. So there's a famous Elvis Presley movie, King Creole, where Elvis looks at the guy who's his first manager, and he's looking a bit sheepish because he's about to leave it. And the guy says, what's the matter, Elvis, whatever he calls him? What's the matter? He says, I'm trying to work out how to tear up a handshake. And I think Jazz and Simon are saying to themselves, we don't have a contract. It's just on a handshake. And so far, Simon, Andrew and George have been honourable. But how do we know that George is going to stay with us as managers? Because let's face it, what Simon was a genius at he was a manipulator, but in a good way. He did what he needed to do to make Wham successful. You remember the Wake Me Up Before You Go video? They wore sportswear shorts by a company called FILA. And it was Jazz and Simon that did the deal for the franchising, the branding deal. And they were wearing shuttlecocks in their shorts. I don't know why. They all seemed to like it. That came from Jazz and Simon. So They were very useful for that. But when George is thinking about himself being like Elton John or Stevie Wonder, a serious artist, he doesn't need that kind of manager. And in fact, he ended up with a wonderful American manager called Michael Lippman, who passed away about 6 months ago. If you look up that name, Michael Lippman, he was a wonderful manager for George. And so I think Jazz and Simon knew that. And that is why Lindsay got fired. Because I'm giving you all that now. The film, the origin of the film, when I suggested the film to Jazz, I said, look, we could do an MTV type puff piece, just an obvious thing with all, just shots of them larking around and having fun, and a bit of concert footage and a few beauty shots of China. I said, but where would that get you? That would just get you appealing to the same fans you already got, and that would just get you the MTV crowd, but you've got the MTV crowd. It would just get you the British tabloid press like you, but you've already got that. But if you do a serious documentary about this film, with not a puff piece, but something about China and Wham, this juxtaposition about China on the cusp of a new era. And wouldn't that be magnificent if you could do that juxtaposition? It won't make you $1 million, but you can put that in film festivals. And the serious newspapers, the Times of London, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the serious people will see George and Andrew, will see George's music, their music, and they'll be cultural ambassadors. That was the term I used at the time. I said that lifts them way above Duran Duran, way above culture. And Jazz loved that. He was a smart guy, Jazz, and saw what that would do. I said, so it's not going to make a gazillion, but it'll lift them to a higher plane, and they'll be regarded in a better light, and they'll be above everybody else. And Jazz said, I want that. And in fact, I'm glad it's in his memoir. It's not just my word, but it's in Jazz's book. Jazz Summers, look up his book. But spool forward, that was February of 85. Spool forward to September, October, and then Jazz and Simon are looking at each other and saying the Golden Goose is leaving. There's no more tours. That it's over. One show in London, and that's it. The final. That was it in '86, and they're done. We've got nothing more coming in. No records, nothing. Just even though the final album was actually just a few singles cobbled together. We need a cash cow. We need a get-rich-quick thing before the bubble bursts. And just a year before, home videos in that time were mainly rented. You went to the Blockbuster and rented a video. They weren't sold because they were like $80, $90. They were too expensive. Then Vestron put out a thing called Making Michael Jackson's Thriller. And it was all the behind the scenes of that incredible music video. That sold millions. And suddenly, Jazz and Simon, a light bulb goes on. Oh, we need a cash cow. We need a way to make money because we're losing our golden goose. I know that idea of the film being a beautiful documentary for film festivals and the intelligentsia and sod all that. Let's just put out something that could sell a gazillion copies on VHS. And that was the thinking. And on one level, I can see it. I can see it from their point of view. They wanted to make money. And what Lindsay was making was close to this. Not identical, obviously, because this is 40 years later. Lindsay was making a beautiful, elegant film showing George and Andrew in a good light, but showing China equally and this mixture of the two. And they decided to scrap it. And the way they did it, film movie was great. They told George, they manipulated George and Andrew against the film. They mentioned the film was never finished, it was just an early rough cut. And I don't know if you can imagine from all the things you saw of Simon up there on the screen, he can be a little bit on the manipulative side. It can work in your favour. It worked in terms of getting the Chinese government on board. Yeah, it worked. He was not straight with George and Andrew. They never told them the game plan was to make the film a serious film. They just said, we're going to make a film. And so to George and Andrew, it was just going to be a puff piece like what we did on our vacation. They had no idea of the game plan. And I didn't know this at the time. I thought they knew, but no, they'd never told them because, why bother the artists? So when they came up with this new idea in the end of September, beginning of October of 2005, they decided, we've got to get rid of Lindsay. How do we do it? He had a contract. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was doing what he was hired to do. So they came up with, I know, we will manipulate George and Andrew. And what they did was they told George and Andrew nothing and just said, oh, we've got the film, it's fantastic, it's full of like blah, blah, blah. They showed the film, it's a rough cut. George and Andrew were not used to seeing serious documentaries. They watched MTV. Like we all did that. They weren't used to serious documentaries. They looked at it and they found it a little bit slow, which it was. I would say saintly, but it certainly wasn't an MTV boom, 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 boom film. It was different. And so, and Jazz went to this, do you like it? No, not really. Right, that's okay, we'll get rid of it. That was how it started. And I was faced with a terrible thing because I'd known Jazz for 14 years at that time. I liked it. And I was asked to fire Lindsay. Now, Lindsay won an Oscar in 1954 for a short film. He made a film called If, Oh Lucky Man, This Sporting Life. It was a wonderful film. And I'd only known him 6 months. And I'd known Jazz for 14 years. And he said to me, you've got to fire him. And I said, fire him? I can't do that. And if I'd been smart or, in it for the money, I think I'd have just stuck with Jazz. I know him longer, and I might have been still in the running to do more stuff with George. But I'm not noble, courageous. I just couldn't do it. Lindsay Anderson was like Martin Scorsese was to Americans. He was like a serious, revered filmmaker. And so I said, I can't. So Jazz fired him by a phone call. Remember, that was the era where pop stars divorced their wives by fax. So, he was, and that was it. And then they ended up making another a version of it, a 60-minute version called, what was it called? Oh, the Foreign Skies, which was kind of cheesy. It was okay, but it wasn't Lindsay's film. So that's really what happened. And so I'm disappointed when I read stuff saying, oh, it was a bad film. It wasn't finished. And Andrew says things like, oh, he wasn't the right guy. Bless him, I love Andrew, but Andrew didn't know the backstory. So, and he'd been led to think it's going to be a home movie, just what we did on our vacation. So that's a bit of background that no one knows, but I thought I'd share with you.
Because the story I always heard was that Lindsay Anderson had socialist or communist meetings, and so he was interested in capturing oh my god, I'm a Westerner in China for the first time. I get to see all this stuff. And then the band saw that and were we wanted live concert. That's the story I've always heard.
Right. And there's never that. Lindsay was part of the old left in England, so he was fascinated by it. He liked the idea of this mixture of culture.
I mean, it's also the footage we saw was clearly just fascinating because he was.
Yeah, because he thought that was an interesting thing. What I'll tell you where he was a little disappointed was that he wanted a relationship with his artist. If any of you ever saw the film If with Malcolm McDowell, Malcolm McDowell was 25, so a little bit older than George and Andrew at that time. And Lindsay had a relationship with him. They did a film called Oh Lucky Man, and he had a relationship with Alan Price, who was the guy from The Animals, keyboard player. And he loved collaborating. And he wanted to collaborate with George, but the managers kept George and Lindsay apart. This was when they were back in England. And so Lindsay kept writing letters to George, but they were never delivered. I asked George, never got it. They had to go to the management office, and they just cut him off. And so that, so it was disappointed on that. But no, it wasn't. It wasn't for that reason. He genuinely liked the idea. Initially, he came on board. It was a gig. And he wasn't making money, so it was a money gig. I did a real thing where, Andrew did say in an interview recently, he said, well, I read in his diaries, he said he did it for the money. Hello? We all did it for the money. I was doing it for the money. We all do it for the money. It wasn't a crime to be paid to do the thing. The problem was that that's why I said that I'm glad they kept that interview I did. I don't blame George and Andrew at all for what happened. It wasn't their fault. They were not in on it. Other questions? Yes, here and then over here. Yes.
Just a quick one. Did you, as a member of the crew, the band, feel any objection in China? We see, on the film, it looks like they're pretty open to it. We hear about them taking people out because they're guessing. Do you feel any of the sense that they were pushing that kind of sense of what you were filming?
There was definitely a vibe, and I felt it more in one show than we did in Beijing. But there was definitely, I mean, you saw it in those little interviews with the people in the group. There was something happening that we didn't quite understand what it was, but we could tell. And like the assistant, the lovely American girl you heard a few times, Lee, to production assistant, and she said, suddenly we're driving over the airport and suddenly you see this modern futuristic hotel. I remember going into it, I think, where am I? It's like I'm in Indianapolis or Cleveland. What's this hotel in the middle of all this poverty? It made no sense. So there was something going on, but we didn't quite know what it was. It's hard to understand. Somebody over here, yes.
I've never heard George Michael sing Careless Whisper so beautifully. Are there any plans to release a full concert at Guangzhou in the future?
We had all of it shot. The audio is all there. There's not as much film footage. One of the things, and that was another misunderstanding, to film in China at that time, it's one thing filming a concert in America. Even in those days, to shoot a concert in America, you would normally have 8 to 10 cameras because you want to get all the close-ups and everything that you get. We only had 5 cameras because we weren't shooting a concert film. We were doing a documentary with a bit of music in it. So we didn't have enough cameras to do justice. But we had great audio equipment. That's why that sounds so beautiful. I will let you in on another little story. When a camera crew is shooting a concert, we can't get in the way of the audience. Normally, if you want to get close-ups of the artists on stage, you can't do it because you'd be in the way of us, the audience. So what is normally done is the day after a concert, you go in an empty stage and your cameras can go everywhere because there's no one to be blocking. You won't block anyone's view. And you do all the close-ups. Well, the morning after that concert, the Guangzhou concert, I start to get everyone assembled and we're going to shoot. And then suddenly, we're all ready to go. And then suddenly George says to me, I don't feel like doing it. What? I said, I don't feel like doing it. I said, why? He said, it's too humid in here. My hair's going to frizz. And I thought he was just joking. By the way, did you see that scene in the football game where his hair's completely frizzed? And I say something like, "Ain't that grey? Wash it away." I can't believe myself. But he was very conscious about his hair, and he famously, the Careless Whisper music video, he was really shocked because he didn't like his hair in it. So I was sensitive to that. And he said, it's too humid, my hair's going to go frizzy, I can't do it. Well, I said, but we have to have it because it's our last day, and we need the close-ups. And he said, well, I just don't want to do it. Now, there's a point where you are in service to the star. You can offer common sense, but you can't tell them what to do. So I said, well, but we need close-ups. And he said, well, can't we just shoot it all at Shepperton? Shepperton's a film studio outside London. I said, what, recreate a Chinese in London? Well, there's about 14 or 15 people on stage with costumes and stuff. I said, we can't do that. He said, Martin, anything can be done. I said, well, yes, technically, but I know. And he said, why can't we? I said, well, it would cost a fortune. He said, how much? I hadn't got a clue. I'm not that type of producer. I don't do numbers. I just said, a lot. And then one of the guys who's only briefly seen in the film was my associate producer. He's the guy that does the numbers. I ran it. I said, hold that thought. Let me go check. I went over to Michael. George wants to shoot all this at Shepperton. Listen, it's crazy. I said, that's crazy. Here's what. Tell me how much it costs. Just a ballpark number. Make it high. Just give me a ballpark number. And that will put George off. And then we'll shoot. Oh, no, because the first I forgot. My first thing was I told George, which was bullshit on a level with Simon. I said I'd get dehumidifiers. Where else I get dehumidifiers?
That's amazing.
Bullshit. And I think George saw through that. So Michael does some numbers and about 10 minutes to come back and say, to redo it, get all the people together, we could do it, but it cost about $250,000. I went over to George, I said, George, you're quite right, we can shoot at Shepperton, we've done the rough numbers, it'll cost $500,000. I thought I'd better allow a little bit more just in case. I said, $500,000. And George said, okay, I'll do it. I said, and it's $500,000. He it's my money. I said, yes, it's your money. Okay, that's what we'll do. And that's what we did. We cancelled the shoot. We assembled in London out of the shoot studio 2 weeks later and refilmed it. I look at it and I can see the close-ups. I can see the difference in the main difference because people, even in those days, we just took Polaroids of everybody, what they were wearing. But I look at the close-up and the brooch that's that side is something on that side. But the best of all, we're all assembled, all ready to go, and in comes Andrew with a Buzz crew car. Astronaut from 1960. I said, what's that? Oh, so I've done something wrong. I said, no, you like you romantic look now. You look like you're going to Cape Canaveral. So we had to go and rush out to make a wig. When I look at it, I can see the wig. It's not the same as it's. But we did that. But those were the sort of things that the budget did skyrocket alone. And went a bit crazy. But, you know, that was, I only have the fondest memories of that trip. I have fond memories of George. I was closer to George than Andrew. Very fond memories of George. We stayed friends, as I mentioned. Simon, okay, we say hi if we see each other. But Jazz was a really sweet guy, very hard worker, undersung hero. He deserves, if any of you do social media and stuff like that, you'll feel welcome to mention any of this. I'm not holding anything back, no secrets. Feel free to mention some of this stuff. But Jazz Summers is an undersung hero. And Lindsay Anderson, a real important person without whom we would not have had this film. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned George wanted to be considered a serious singer. And I wanted to know, at what point do you feel that he felt himself on the serious singer? When did he arrive at that?
I think it was coming from Careless Whisper, Everything She Wants. It was going beyond TV. I mean, the early stuff was fun and frothy and bubblegumish, but say he's writing, and I remember we talked about music all the time. His favourite album at that point was Avalon by Roxy Music. He was fascinated because I was a big Beatles junkie. So we talked about John Lennon. He liked John Lennon. Famously, he bought John Lennon's Imagine piano. And his aspirations were beyond just clubbing and just sort of silly stuff. He wanted to be taken seriously. And in fact, at one point, I remember I went to him because I was friendly with Dionne Warwick, and she'd asked me if George would be interested in doing a duet. And I asked George, and he said, I like Dionne, but she's not gravelly enough. And then he said, I'm going to do something with Aretha. And that was the smart move. He was absolutely right. Dionne Warwick was too middle of the road. Lovely artist. But George had his eye on something more serious, which is why the Listen Without Prejudice, and Listen Without Prejudice, my favourite of his solo, because he's really stretching himself way, way beyond the pop era.
Do you think he arrived at his goal?
Sorry?
When do you think he arrived at his goal as being considered?
I think, I thought that he was really hitting a peak with Listen Without Prejudice, but he was a tortured soul. And sometimes when we're growing up, we make mistakes and we make poor decisions. His decision to sue his record company was a bad one. Now, if it was the record contract he signed when he was 18, which was a record, that's one thing. But the record contract he happily signed in 86 or 87 was a great contract, had a huge amount of money for it. And when he was cross-examined, he took it to court, which is never a good idea. He went to court, and under cross-examination was asked, did you sign the contract willingly or did they twist your arm? No, I didn't. Did you accept $20 million? Yes, I did. I mean, case over. He lost the case. It was a bad decision. So he started making bad decisions. He was very tied up with smoking dope, and that was blunting his intelligence. And the strain of what happened, the way he was treated when he was convicted, I know that he was not, his orientation was not yet set. He had a lovely girlfriend called Kathy, who was the girl in the I Want Your Sex video, who was a makeup artist. She was a lovely. George was not yet determined one way or the other. But once the tabloid got hold of him and that bust the bust in Beverly Hills, I remember him saying to me, I said, how could you know that plain clothes cop? And George said, he wasn't plain clothes, that was a $2,000 Gucci jacket. and I went on TV. In Britain, you don't, if you're busted or like that, you're told to keep away from TV, friends. No one should speak in case it prejudices the case. That's the way it's done in Britain. Yeah, I thought George was getting attacked in the press so much and roasted. So I went on one of those tabloid shows, Current Affair or Inside Edition or something like that, and defended George. And I used his line about the guy with the $2,000 Gucci jacket. And when I ran into George and I told him about it, he was touched that I had stood up for him. But the thing that made him really laugh was that being a tabloid TV show, they put a caption up. I happen to be straight, I'm gay friends, I'm straight friends. But the caption said, producer and long-time companion. I was in hysterics. I've outed you, Martin, I've outed you. So that was when it went really bad for him. He started to, when he died, I did an interview where I said it reminded me in a lot of ways of George Harrison, not in terms of music, but that George loved making music but hated being a Beatle. John and Paul were happy with it, especially Paul. They liked being George didn't like that part of it. George Harrison and George Michael didn't too. He wanted to make music. He didn't want to be a spectator. And unfortunately, in our era, you had to do both. So I think that was where he got on the wobbly question here.
So, post China, I guess two-part question was like, since you have gone through, you went through experience being there, were you called upon the other artists if we went to China, and also what was the impact of Wham being there after they were there? Like the other artists, was there a flood of other artists going to China?
Well, if that waited a time because of Tiananmen Square happened a couple of years later. No, it all went to Russia. That was when Billy Joel, Motley Crue, a whole bunch of artists started going to Russia, and there were concerts. In time, there were other artists who went to China, but it didn't really happen again after that because Tiananmen Square was quite such a bitter thing any others, or have exhausted you all? Over here.
What actually happened to the trumpet player?
He recovered. They mentioned in the film that he did recover. I mean, he had a mental episode. I wasn't with him. George, Andrew, Simon, and myself stayed in Beijing with Lindsay, and the others went ahead to Guangzhou and they were on the plane. And in fact, in the foreign skies, there's a lovely scene they used here. I think they were trying to avoid replicating what had already been released. There's a lovely scene in the market, and I sort of like, the cameraman sort of said, come on, get and go, because George and Andrew could be a little bit shy about initiating stuff, because it was contrived. Of course it was contrived. So they threw me in there to be somebody to banter. And there's a scene where I'm bantering with them at markets where they're buying stuff, like going to a flea market. And it's really charming footage. I hope they, maybe, Andrew said something the other day about maybe they should do a box set of Foreign Skies, Lindsay's cut, please, and this, which I think would be a great idea. By the way, I was surprised. Lindsay wouldn't dream of me being I'm not in Lindsay's cut of film. I wouldn't be. I was trying to get off to the side. In Foreign Skies, they put that in, not because I was in it, but because it was some very charming stuff with George Mann. Mike, the director, on the phone said, Martin, you're in this film a lot. I said, why? Why am I in it? He said, you were working with them all the time, and I didn't recall that at all. I mean, I was such a frazzle all the time. I didn't understand, oh yeah, you're the one that's helping them out. Their managers are off to the side, the publicist's opposite, there's no one with them. So apparently I just reflexively stepped in. And because we had a bantering relationship, especially George and I, by the way, two things that George had against. One, late at night in Guangzhou, they had a disco, so we all went there and danced. And at the end of the evening, George said, Martin, I don't normally say this, I've been in discos and clubs all over the world. I've never seen a worse dancer in my life. Hands down, the worst dancer was a badge of honour. But they used to tease me about my clothes. Now, I had more costume changes in this film than Diana Ross. Someplace I'm in a pink suit at the end. I'm in this. And in a bit of the football game, you may see I'm in a fringe jacket, a suede fringe jacket, because I'm an old hippie. So like something that Roger Daltrey wore at Woodstock. And so George used to mock that every time I know, here's bloody Woodstock again. My God, you bloody old hippies. However, 6 months later, I'm your man video, bloody black leather fringes. So I went to him and said, you got that from me, I want a credit for that. That was the relationship we had. I loved him dearly, and it was a teasing, I'm the older hippie, but it was a teasing relationship. I wouldn't trade for the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Because I love this film and I want it to do well and I want people to see it.
That's so good. Thank you.